The grand hall was a symphony of gold and shadow, heavy with the scent of roasted meat and alpha dominance. Zara stood trembling by the polished marble pillar. Her simple, coarse dress was a stark contrast to the shimmering silks of the nobility. She was only there to clean and to remain invisible. But her fingers, stained with the vibrant purple of crushed wolfsbane and sulfur, slipped. The fragile glass vial plummeted. It shattered against the immaculate floor with a sharp echoing crack. Instantly, a pungent, acrid cloud bloomed into the air, silencing the joyous roars of the coronation ceremony. Every predatory gaze snapped toward her. At the center of the dais stood Alpha King Kaelen, his eyes the color of a gathering storm, locked onto her small, trembling frame. The absolute disgust radiating from him hit her like a physical blow. He did not yell. His voice was a low, lethal rumble that carried through the suffocating silence, commanding the guards to remove the foul-smelling creature from his sight and declaring her a defective stain upon their sacred tradition. The cruel laughter of the pack erupted around her in a chorus of mockery that tore at her chest. Humiliation burned hot tears into her eyes. Zara turned and fled. She ran blindly through the heavy oak doors, plunging into the freezing, relentless downpour of the night, with the look of utter revulsion from the king seared into her soul. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The dark residue in her vial was not an isolated failure. It was a warning. The following morning, Zara slipped out of the palace kitchens to empty the slop buckets near the outer agricultural rings. The air here usually carried the rich, comforting scent of damp earth and growing things. Today, however, a sickly sweet odor hung heavy in the morning mist. It smelled like fermented honey mixed with rotting copper. She knelt by the edges of the wheat fields. The golden stalks were marred by weeping black lesions. Zara reached out gently, brushing a finger against the afflicted plant. The black ooze felt warm, almost vibrating with a microscopic frenzy. Nearby, the pack livestock stood listless. A massive draft horse snorted, shaking its heavy head, but its eyes were clouded, and its breath carried the same terrifying metallic sweetness. The farmers walked past, oblivious, swinging their scythes and complaining about the unseasonable dampness. The traditional healers, in their long green robes, merely tossed handfuls of blessed salt onto the soil, chanting prayers to the earth goddess. They were blind. Zara could see the invisible war being waged on a cellular level. The soil was not angry, it was infected. She broke off a corrupted stalk, sealing it carefully inside a hollowed-out reed from her pocket. She had to get back to the shadows. Down in the suffocating silence of her cellar laboratory, Zara ignited her spirit lamps. The flickering flames cast long dancing shadows against the damp stone walls. She extracted the black weeping sap from the wheat stalk using a meticulously sanitized glass needle. Dropping the sample onto a polished crystal lens, she leaned over her handmade viewing apparatus. It was a crude microscope built from layered magnifying glasses scavenged from the royal archives, but it was powerful enough to reveal the nightmare. The pathogen was a beautiful, terrifying marvel. She watched the dark, jagged spores tearing through the fibrous plant cells like microscopic wolves tearing through meat. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated intelligence, multiplying at an exponential rate. Her mind shifted gears, falling into that quiet, brilliant rhythm that made her entirely unique. While the Alpha King ruled the physical realm, Zara commanded the invisible architecture of life. She did not just see the rot, she understood its chemical geometry. She visualized the weak points in the outer lipid shells of the spores. They were acidic, thriving in the damp, low-oxygen environment of the plant tissue. To break the siege, she needed a compound that was highly alkaline but structurally complex enough to bond with the pathogen before destroying it. She moved across her laboratory with the grace of a dancer. Her hands flew over racks of dried herbs, powdered minerals, and distilled acids. She started with the silver leaf extract, the blue liquid she had synthesized the night before. It was a powerful antibacterial agent, but it lacked the sheer chemical aggression to pierce this new enemy. She needed a catalyst. Zara opened a heavy lead-lined box, pulling out a chunk of raw, unprocessed phosphorus she had traded 3 weeks of bread rations to obtain from the miners. Sweating in the enclosed heat of the cellar, she ground the mineral into a fine, luminescent dust. She added the powder to a heavy iron crucible, mixing it with distilled willow bark and a precise measure of concentrated lye. The mixture hissed and spat, sending angry plumes of white smoke into the air. Zara held her breath, her eyes stinging from the fumes, as she carefully decanted the new, highly volatile solution into a clear glass beaker. The liquid settled into a shimmering pale gold. It looked like captured sunlight. Her hands were steady despite her racing heart, as she drew a single drop of the golden serum into a glass pipette. She returned to her viewing apparatus. The black spores were swarming violently across the crystal lens, consuming the last of the health. Zara held her breath and released the single golden drop into the center of the darkness. The reaction was instantaneous. A microscopic shockwave rippled across the lens. The golden compound collided with the jagged black spores, dissolving their acidic shells on contact. The terrifying movement stopped abruptly. The black rot dissolved, melting into harmless inert water and basic carbon. The pathogen was completely neutralized. Zara exhaled a long, shaky breath, gripping the edges of her wooden table until her knuckles turned white. She had done it. She had found the chemical key to dismantle the silent killer. She had cured the rot. A brilliant smile touched her lips, a rare moment of pure, unadulterated triumph in a life defined by subjugation. But her victory was suddenly shattered. The heavy iron door of the cellar rattled under the weight of a sudden violent impact. Someone was outside. A deep, agonizing cough echoed down the stone corridor, echoing with wet, heavy desperation. Zara froze. Beneath the iron door she heard the heavy, dragging footsteps of a royal guard. And then the terrifying scent slithered through the crack beneath the door. It was the exact same odor. Fermented honey mixed with rotting copper. The sickness was no longer just in the fields, it had found its way into the pack. The damp walls of her hidden sanctuary suddenly felt like a cage closing in around her racing heart. The wet, agonizing cough, echoing from the stone corridor, tore through the fragile silence of the cellar. It was a sound Zara knew too well. The horrifying rasping breath acted like a cruel key, unlocking a door in her mind that she had spent years desperately trying to seal shut. The scent of copper and sickness dissolved the damp walls of her hidden laboratory, replacing them with the memory of a bitterly cold winter night from her childhood. She was 7 years old again, hiding beneath the floorboards of a small wooden cottage on the edges of the packed territory. Above her, the heavy boots of the royal guard thundered against the timber. Her mother, Eliana, had been a woman of extraordinary brilliance. Like Zara, she had possessed the rare gift of seeing the hidden architecture of nature. While the traditional elders mumbled their prayers over open wounds, Eliana had boiled willow bark to extract pain-numbing compounds and stitched torn flesh using thread soaked in distilled pine resin to prevent infection. She had been a miracle worker. But in a world ruled by fangs and ancient superstitions, a miracle that could not be explained by the will of the earth goddess was called witchcraft. Zara squeezed her eyes shut, remembering the terrifying crash of shattering glass as the guards destroyed her mother's life work. Through the narrow slats of the floorboards, she had watched the grand healer point a trembling finger at the simple chemical distillers and glass tubing. The old Alpha had screamed that Eliana was poisoning the spirit of the pack using dark magic to defy the natural order of life and death. The trial had not been a search for the truth. It had been a public execution of intellect. They dragged Eliana out into the freezing snow. Her mother did not beg. She stood tall, her chin raised, even as the frost bit into her pale skin. Zara remembered the absolute terrifying stillness of the night as the old Alpha King pronounced the sentence of permanent exile, stripping her of her pack scent and casting her out into the deadly winter wasteland without food or shelter. It was a death sentence masquerading as mercy. Right before the guards forced her away, Eliana had looked directly at the floorboards where Zara was hiding. Her mother's eyes had held no fear, only a fierce burning command. Hide your fire, little bird. They will burn you at the stake for the light you carry. Survive. The memory of that look had defined Zara's entire existence. It was the reason she had scrubbed floors until her hands bled. It was the reason she swallowed her pride and accepted the cruel mockery of the other Omegas. It was the reason she had allowed the new Alpha King Kaelen to cast her into the lowest caste without raising her voice to defend herself. To be invisible was to be safe. To be brilliant was to invite death. The phantom cold of that childhood winter seeped into her bones, freezing her in place beside her wooden workbench. If she stepped outside this cellar and revealed the golden serum she had just synthesized, the traditional healers would not thank her. They would see the glass beakers, the chemical powders, and the glowing liquids, and they would burn her, just as they had condemned her mother. They would destroy the cure out of sheer ignorant terror. Zara looked down at her trembling hands. They were scarred from harsh cleaning chemicals and calloused from years of manual labor. She was an Omega. She was voiceless. She was the dirt beneath the boots of the royal warriors. But then she looked at the glass beaker resting on her table. The pale golden liquid shimmered in the candlelight, holding the absolute power of life and death. Her mother had died because she was a pioneer standing alone in the dark. But her mother's work had not died with her. It had evolved. It had survived within Zara. The desperate, agonizing cough echoed from the corridor, again followed by the heavy thud of a body collapsing against the stone wall. An alpha warrior was dying right outside her sanctuary. The pack that had scorned her, the society that had crushed her spirit and killed her mother, was now facing an enemy they could not punch or claw into submission. Zara slowly closed her fingers around the warm glass of the beaker. The paralyzing ice of her childhood trauma began to melt, replaced by a quiet, rising inferno of purpose. She would not let them die in ignorance. She would not hide her fire anymore. The dawn sky over the royal citadel was an ugly bruised purple. When Alpha King Kaelen realized his grand kingdom was falling, he stood at the massive arched entrance of the vanguard barracks, the undisputed heart of his military might. The air inside was supposed to smell of polished leather, heavy sweat, and the sharp pine scent of dominant alphas ready for brutal combat. Instead, a thick cloying stench of fermented honey and rotting copper hit him like a physical blow, forcing his massive frame to halt in the door. It was the exact foul smell that had been reported in the lower agricultural rings just yesterday, but magnified 100-fold. Kaelen stepped into the dim, cavernous hall, and the horrific sight before him turned his burning blood to ice. These were the legendary stone wolves, the most feared warriors on the entire continent, men who could shatter solid boulders with their bare hands and run for days without rest. Now they lay scattered helplessly across their wooden cots, writhing in unimaginable agony. Heavy muscular bodies trembled violently beneath sweat-soaked furs. The terrifying chorus of wet, agonizing coughs echoed against the cold stone walls, creating a dark symphony of defeat that grated violently against Kaelen's primal instincts. His inner wolf clawed viciously at his chest, demanding a physical enemy, to bite a throat, to rip a skull, to crush into powder. But there was absolutely nothing to fight. The deadly enemy was entirely invisible. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his heavy boots echoing like slow funeral drums in the gloomy light. General Thorn, his second-in-command and oldest trusted friend, was slumped weakly against a carved wooden pillar. Thorn's normally ruddy and fierce face was a ghastly shade of pale gray, and dark, weeping lesions marred the thick, strong cords of his neck. Kaelen knelt carefully beside him, placing a large, calloused hand on the general's burning shoulder. His skin felt like an open furnace. Thorn forced his heavy eyelids open, his pupils blown wide with consuming fever. "My king," the general rasped, his deep voice reduced to a wet, pitiful gurgle. "I cannot stand. My legs have turned to water. There's a raging fire deep inside my lungs. I cannot see the enemy to shield you from their blades." Kaelen tightened his grip, his strong jaw locking in a helpless, furious frustration. "Rest now, my old friend," he ordered softly, hiding the cold terror that threatened to bleed into his commanding voice. "You have fought enough bloody battles for one lifetime. Let the royal healers fight this invisible one." But the royal healers were failing miserably. Kaelen stood to his full height and surveyed the utter chaos of the barracks. At the far end of the sprawling hall, the high elder of the healing caste was desperately waving a smoking bundle of dried sage over a convulsing young soldier. The elder chanted ancient rhyming prayers, calling upon the merciful earth goddess to purge the dark evil spirits from the warrior's tainted blood. Kaelen watched with narrowed eyes as the old man smeared a thick, foul-smelling green paste of mashed herbs and river clay directly onto the soldier's heaving chest. It did absolutely nothing. The young soldier suddenly arched his back violently, letting out a horrifying choking sound before collapsing completely still against the mattress. The fierce spark of life vanished instantly from his unseeing eyes. Kaelen felt a massive invisible weight settle heavily onto his broad shoulders, threatening to crush his spine into dust. He strode aggressively toward the high elder, his raw anger vibrating fiercely through the heavy, stagnant air. "Your ancient prayers are nothing but empty wind," Kaelen growled, his deep voice vibrating with pure alpha command. "My strongest men are drowning in their own blood, and you offer them nothing but smoke and wet mud. Give them something real. Give them a permanent cure." The high elder bowed, his bald head trembling uncontrollably under the sheer, terrifying force of the king's dominant aura. "My powerful king, this is no natural earthly sickness," the elder stammered, nervously wiping cold sweat from his wrinkled brow with a shaking hand. "The earth goddess is punishing our pride. The soil itself is tainted. The very air we breathe is cursed by dark magic. The ancient, proven remedies have no power against this shadow. We can only pray for swift mercy and immediately isolate the dying to protect them." Kaelen grabbed the elder roughly by the front of his green robes, lifting him effortlessly off the stone ground. "A true king does not pray for mercy while his sacred pack is slaughtered in their beds," he snarled, dropping the terrified old man aggressively back to the floor. "If you cannot cure my soldiers, you are utterly useless to my kingdom." Kaelen turned sharply away, pacing the long length of the tragic hall like a caged beast. His sharp mind was a chaotic storm of rapid tactical analysis and rising cold panic. He had built his glorious reign on absolute unyielding physical strength. He had conquered violent rogue territories, forged ironclad political alliances, and created an impenetrable mountain fortress. Yet all his vast physical power was utterly useless against a microscopic, silent invader. The terrifying, grim reality dawned on him with crushing absolute finality. He was losing his entire army. Without the vanguard defenders, the neighboring rival territories would smell the sickening weakness in the wind. They would swarm the borders within weeks, tearing his beautiful kingdom apart piece by bloody piece. The grand legacy he had bled so deeply to build was evaporating overnight, He looked closely at the pale faces of his dying men, young brave warriors who had sworn their very lives to him, trusting him completely to lead them always to victory. He had failed them. He could not protect his loyal pack from the invisible shadow creeping silently through their veins. A sudden loud commotion broke his dark, agonizing reverie. The heavy reinforced oak doors at the far end of the barracks banged open violently. Two young palace guards stumbled clumsily inside, dragging another muscular alpha between. The sick warrior was vomiting a dark, foul-smelling liquid directly onto the pristine stone floor. "Put him down immediately," Kaelen ordered, striding quickly toward the noisy commotion. As he approached cautiously, he recognized the sick young. It was Valen, a newly initiated border scout who had been securely stationed at the inner palace gates. Kaelen felt a cold, sharp spike of pure dread pierce his beating heart. The inner royal gates. The sickness was no longer safely confined to the isolated vanguard barracks. It had breached the heavily guarded royal compound. Valen collapsed heavily at the king's feet, convulsing violently against the cold floor. The sweet, rotting, coppery stench radiating strongly from his pores was completely overpowering. Kaelen knelt purely by instinct, reaching out a bare hand to physically stabilize the thrashing young man. As his bare fingers brushed gently against Valen's burning wet skin, Kaelen felt a sudden, sharp, intense pain deep inside his own broad chest. It was brief but absolutely unmistakable, like a tiny, jagged shard of broken glass lodging deep within his lower lungs. He drew in a slow, very cautious breath. The heavy air suddenly tasted faintly of bitter copper. The invincible king of the most powerful pack on the entire continent slowly rose to his full imposing height, looking down in quiet horror at his own trembling hands. The invincible walls of his great fortress had completely fallen. The strict quarantine was a spectacular, terrifying failure. The invisible enemy was not just waiting outside the heavy gates, it was already inside his own house. And as a wet, heavy, persistent tickle started to crawl slowly up his own tight throat, Kaelen realized the deadly shadow had finally found him. The royal quarantine was absolute and brutally enforced by lines of towering guards surrounding the outer medical pavilions. Heavy canvas tents had been erected hastily over the training grounds, flapping ominously like massive dark wings in the biting night wind. Zara crouched low behind a stack of wooden supply crates, her slender arms wrapped protectively around a heavy leather satchel. Inside that battered bag rested dozens of glass vials filled with her synthesized golden compound, along with pure distilled alcohol and tightly woven linen masks soaked in strong eucalyptus extract. She had spent the last 2 days awake, constantly mixing and boiling in the damp isolation of her cellar to create enough serum to hold the line against the plague. The royal decree mandated that anyone attempting to enter the contaminated zone without the express permission of the Alpha King would be executed on sight. But the laws of alphas meant absolutely nothing when measured against the unyielding mathematics of an escalating biological infection. Zara tightened the pungent medicinal mask over her nose, breathing in the sharp, stinging aroma that cleared her mind. She waited until the pacing perimeter guard turned his back to light a damp torch. Moving with the silent, fluid grace born from years of avoiding the harsh blows of her superiors, Zara slipped gracefully beneath the heavy canvas flap of the primary isolation tent, stepping directly into the abyss. The sheer scale of the devastation inside the massive pavilion struck her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Rows upon rows of cots stretched into the gloomy shadows, filled with the groans and wet, agonizing coughs of dying. The thick air was completely saturated with the sickening odor of rotting copper and the terrifying heat of raging fevers. The few traditional healers present looked completely exhausted and utterly lost, waving their useless, smoldering sage sticks over the dying men. Zara felt a deep, sharp surge of pure, righteous anger cut through her residual fear. These grand elders who had mocked her mother and banished her to the shadows were watching their people drown in their own blood, doing absolutely nothing of true value. She tightened her grip on her leather satchel and stepped into the dim lantern light, her spine straightening with fierce, absolute purpose. She was no longer the invisible, frightened Omega trembling at the back of a grand hall. She was the only true scientist in a realm drowning in blind superstition, and she was taking complete control of this battlefield. A young apprentice healer, wearing a pristine green robe, stepped frantically into her path, his eyes wide with shocked outrage. He raised a shaking hand, pointing an accusing finger at her simple gray dress. "You're forbidden to be here," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Only the chosen disciples of the Earth Goddess may tend to the cursed blood. Get out before I summon the armed guard." Zara did not shrink back. She stepped forward with such intense, commanding authority that the young alpha stumbled backward, instinctively submitting to an energy far more powerful than raw physical strength. "If you want these men to live, you will close your mouth and listen to exactly what I tell you," Zara ordered, her clear voice ringing with absolute, undeniable certainty. "Your useless prayers and dirty clay poultices are actively breeding the very infection you seek to cure. Pointing toward a large neglected iron cauldron in the corner, she issued her first unyielding command. Fill that basin with clean water and build a blazing fire beneath it until the water rolls violently. Every single piece of cloth touching these sick men must be boiled instantly. Any healer caught touching an open wound with unwashed hands will answer directly to me. The apprentice stared at her, completely stunned by the fierce, unyielding power radiating from a seemingly low-ranking Omega, but there was something in her luminous, blazing eyes, a terrifying, brilliant clarity that compelled absolute obedience. He nodded mutely and scrambled away to follow her strict instructions. Zara moved swiftly down the central aisle, pulling glass bottles of highly concentrated distilled alcohol from her heavy bag. She splashed the stinging clear liquid generously over her own hands and forearms, rubbing them vigorously before approaching the nearest cot. The warrior lying there was convulsing violently, his thick muscular chest heaving with desperate rattling gasps. Black weeping lesions coated his pale throat exactly like the infected wheat stalks in the outer fields. Zara pulled a delicate glass syringe with a hollowed steel needle from her satchel, her hands perfectly steady despite the horrifying chaos surrounding her. She drew a precise measure of the shimmering pale gold serum into the glass barrel, calculating the exact required dosage based on the warrior's massive body weight. She leaned over the thrashing Alpha, placing a firm, reassuring hand against his burning forehead. "Be completely still," she whispered firmly, expertly locating a thick, pulsing vein along his thick neck. The sharp steel needle pierced his skin, and she smoothly injected the golden chemical compound directly into his tainted bloodstream. For 10 terrifying, agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The warrior continued to choke and thrash. Then the microscopic war shifted dramatically. The alkaline compound collided violently with the jagged black spores raging in his blood, dissolving their acidic outer shells with brutal chemical efficiency. The Alpha warrior suddenly gasped, taking in a massive, deep, desperate lungful of clear air. The horrifying wet rattle in his chest vanished instantly, replaced by the smooth, steady rhythm of unobstructed breathing. The dark, corrupted veins tracking up his neck visibly retreated, fading back into normal, healthy skin as the dangerous fever broke, leaving him drenched in cool sweat and sinking back into a deep, natural, healing sleep. Zara withdrew her needle, wiping the puncture site with a sterile, alcohol-soaked linen pad. She stood up, looking slowly down the long, terrifying row of dying men. Her golden serum was an absolute, flawless victory. A profound, exhilarating sense of empowerment surged fiercely through her veins, washing away an entire lifetime of cruel mockery and silent, invisible suffering. She was saving the very pack that had discarded her, proving that true strength did not reside solely in fangs and claws, but in the brilliant, unyielding power of an educated mind. She moved quickly to the next cot, and then the next, working with relentless mechanical efficiency. She forced the terrified healers to scrub the floors with strong lye, isolating the deeply infected away from those showing only early symptoms. Hours bled into the dark night as she systematically pushed the heavy shadow of death completely out of the massive pavilion. But just as she drained the final drop of serum from her first batch, a frantic, terrified shout echoed loudly from the inner royal quarters, tearing through the calm she had fought so desperately to establish. The High Commander of the Guard rushed blindly into the medical tent, his armor covered in blood and his face pale with absolute, crushing terror, demanding a healer immediately. The plague had breached the highest chamber, and the most powerful Alpha in the entire kingdom had just collapsed. The frantic shout of the High Commander tore through the organized calm Zara had just established. The plague had breached the highest chamber. Alpha King Kaelen had fallen. Without a single moment of hesitation, Zara grabbed the heaviest leather strap of her satchel. Deep inside the darkest corner of her bag, wrapped in thick velvet, rested a single vial of her most potent chemical synthesis. It was a highly concentrated, unstable variation of the golden serum, requiring absolute precision to administer safely. She ignored the terrified protests of the guards and the frantic cries of the remaining healers. She sprinted across the rain-slicked cobblestones of the inner courtyard, her lungs burning as she ascended the grand sweeping staircase toward the royal apex. The king's private sanctuary was a magnificent, sprawling room of dark mahogany and deep crimson silk, but right now it felt like a suffocating tomb. The heavy double doors had been thrown wide open. A dozen elite royal guards stood helplessly along the edges of the room, their faces pale masks of absolute terror. In the center of the massive circular bed lay the most powerful man on the continent, completely undone by an invisible enemy. King Kaelen was convulsing violently, his massive muscular chest heaving with terrifying ragged gasps that sounded like tearing wet parchment. The terrible stench of rotting copper and dark weeping infection was overwhelmingly thick, choking the opulent air. 3 high elders of the traditional healing caste hovered uselessly around the edges of the bed, chanting their repetitive hollow prayers and burning thick bundles of foul-smelling incense. Their cowardice was blatantly obvious. They were standing too far away, terrified of catching the deadly rot themselves. Zara felt a volcanic eruption of pure white-hot fury ignite deep within her chest. "Move out of the way," she commanded, her voice cracking like a physical whip across the chaotic room. The elders turned in absolute shock, staring at the low-ranking Omega who dared to enter the sacred royal sanctum. One elder opened his mouth to protest, raising a trembling hand to summon the guards. Zara did not even let him draw a breath to speak. "If you want your king to survive the next 10 minutes, you will all step back and remain completely silent," she ordered with terrifying absolute authority. The sheer force of her dominant energy, a power born entirely from brilliant intellect and undeniable truth, forced the elders to retreat into the shadows. Zara dropped her heavy satchel onto the plush velvet mattress and climbed directly onto the bed beside the thrashing Alpha King. Kaelen was a magnificent, terrifying creature even in his darkest agony. Sweat poured from his burning skin, soaking the expensive silk sheets. The thick, dark veins along his muscular neck bulged angrily, glowing with the sickly black corruption of the fast-moving pathogen. In his deep delirium, Kaelen was fighting a phantom war. He growled fiercely, blindly thrashing his massive arms, attempting to strike down the invisible shadow tearing his powerful lungs apart. Zara knew she had to cool his core temperature immediately before his brain began to boil inside his skull. She pulled a large glass bottle of highly distilled rubbing alcohol from her bag and ripped a clean square of linen from the bed canopy. Soaking the cloth, she pressed it firmly against his burning forehead and the thick pulse points of his neck. The rapid evaporation of the pure alcohol violently pulled the dangerous heat away from his skin, creating a sudden intense cooling effect. Kaelen let out a deep rumbling groan, leaning unconsciously into the sharp stinging relief. His heavy eyelids fluttered open, but his golden eyes were entirely unfocused, clouded by the dark, terrifying haze of the agonizing fever. Through the suffocating smoke and the agonizing fire consuming his veins, Kaelen saw an angel of absolute mercy descending from the shadows. The sweet, sharp scent of fresh rain, crushed silverleaf, and pure, clean ozone pierced the thick, rotting odor of his own impending death. It was a scent that felt inexplicably familiar, a memory buried under layers of his own brutal arrogance. He felt cool, soothing hands pressing against his burning flesh, anchoring his thrashing spirit to the physical world. He wanted to speak, to command this glowing vision to stay, but his throat was entirely filled with dark, choking blood. He could only stare helplessly as the small, brilliant creature leaned over his chest, her eyes burning with a fierce, luminous fire that completely dwarfed the sun. Zara ignored the sudden, intense weight of his golden gaze. Her mind was entirely focused on the intricate chemical battlefield raging beneath his skin. She retrieved the velvet-wrapped vial, exposing the highly concentrated, shimmering serum. It glowed with a terrifying, brilliant intensity. She drew the thick liquid into a large, reinforced glass syringe, her hands perfectly steady. The king was far too strong, and his convulsions were entirely unpredictable. She needed absolute stillness to hit the major artery directly above his collarbone. "Hold his arms down," she commanded the terrified elite guard standing completely paralyzed near the doorway. "Pin his shoulders to the mattress now." The guards rushed forward, driven by her absolute, undeniable authority. They threw their entire heavy body weight over their thrashing commander, pinning his massive arms to the bed. Kaelen roared in blind, delirious fury, fighting the restraint with terrifying, raw animal strength. Zara leaned her entire body weight heavily over his broad chest, pinning his head in place with her left arm. "Do not fight me, Kaelen," she whispered fiercely directly into his ear. "Let the medicine work. Breathe through the fire." She found the thick, dark vein bulging violently against his neck. With one smooth, flawless motion, she drove the sharp steel needle deep into his tainted flesh, pushing the plunger down and flooding his entire cardiovascular system with a concentrated chemical cure. The reaction was violently explosive. Kaelen's massive body arched completely off the mattress, throwing the heavy elite guards backward. A terrifying wet gasp tore from his throat, echoing loudly against the vaulted ceiling. He froze completely rigid, suspended in a terrifying moment of absolute stillness. And then the miracle happened. The black weeping corruption racing up his neck suddenly halted. The aggressive chemical compound annihilated the deadly pathogen on a microscopic level, tearing apart the dark, jagged spores and flushing them completely from his bloodstream. Kaelen's rigid muscles slowly collapsed, his massive chest fell, and then rose again, drawing in a huge, perfectly clear breath of air. The terrifying, rattling choke was completely gone. His burning skin cooled rapidly beneath her hands, the unnatural heat breaking instantly. The king was saved. Zara slumped backward onto her heels, her entire body trembling violently from the massive adrenaline crash. She wiped a stray strand of sweat-soaked hair from her eyes, staring down at the beautiful, terrifying Alpha, who had once destroyed her entire life with a single cruel word. He was breathing easily now, sinking into a deep restorative sleep. Suddenly, his massive, calloused hand twitched. Before she could move away, his thick, heavy fingers shot out, grasping her delicate wrist with a gentle but entirely unbreakable grip. Even in the depths of his healing unconsciousness, his alpha instincts recognized the profound life-saving anchor beside him. Zara stared down at his large hand wrapped securely around her arm, realizing with a sudden terrifying clarity that the absolute ruler of the continent now owed his very existence to the invisible Omega he had thrown away. The golden morning light filtered through the heavy crimson drapes of the royal bedchamber, casting long warm shadows across the mahogany floor. Alpha King Kaelen opened his eyes. The terrifying, suffocating weight that had crushed his chest the night before was completely gone. He drew a deep, slow breath, filling his massive lungs with clean, clear air. There was no pain. There was no metallic stench of rotting blood, or the terrifying rattling cough that had haunted his darkest nightmares. He was entirely whole. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, felt remarkably clear, though the edges of his memory from the previous night were blurred with the heavy, chaotic smoke of his delirium. He remembered the blinding agony. He remembered the paralyzing fear of his own impending death. But most vividly, he remembered the angel of absolute mercy. The cooling touch upon his burning skin, the sharp, stinging scent of clean alcohol, mixed with fresh rain and crushed silver leaf, and the luminous, fierce eyes that had commanded him to breathe. Kaelen pushed the heavy velvet blankets aside and sat up. His powerful muscles ached with the lingering ghost of the violent convulsions, but his immense alpha strength was already rushing back into his veins. He looked down at his bare chest. The horrifying dark weeping lesions were completely gone, leaving only pale, smooth skin behind. He swung his heavy legs over the edge of the large bed, his bare feet touching the cold, polished stone floor. The heavy double doors of his bedchamber opened slowly. General Thorne stepped inside, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane, but looking infinitely better than the dying broken man Kaelen had seen in the Vanguard barracks. "My King," Thorne murmured, bowing his head with profound respect. "The Earth Goddess has smiled upon us. You have returned from the edge of the great abyss." Kaelen stood up, rolling his broad shoulders. "It was not the Earth Goddess who pulled me back from the dark, Thorne," he stated, his deep voice rumbling with quiet, absolute certainty. "I remember a woman. She smelled of sharp ozone and rain. She brought a cooling fire to my blood and commanded the very shadows to release my soul. Where are the High Elders? Did they finally discover a hidden ancient remedy?" Thorne let out a dry, hollow scoff, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "The High Elders did absolutely nothing but cower in the corners and pray for our swift passage. We were completely lost, my king. The entire Vanguard was drowning in their own blood." But then she walked directly into the center of the nightmare. Kaelen narrowed his golden eyes, stepping closer to his trusted commander. "Who walked into the nightmare?" "A single woman," Thorne answered, his voice thick with uncharacteristic awe and deep, lingering disbelief. "An Omega, she bypassed the heavy armed guards and completely took over the primary medical pavilion. She carried a battered leather satchel filled with glowing golden liquids in sharp, stinging water. She commanded the useless apprentices to boil the linens, and she injected a miraculous fiery cure directly into our dying veins. She moved down the long rows of cots like a fierce avenging spirit, pulling over 100 strong warriors back from the very jaws of death in a single night. When the High Commander informed her that you had fallen, she ran here without hesitation. She saved the entire kingdom while the rest of us were helplessly preparing for a mass burial." Kaelen's heart hammered a sudden violent rhythm against his ribs. An Omega. The vivid fractured memory of his burning delirium snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. He remembered her small, delicate hands expertly finding the thick vein in his neck. He remembered pinning her to the mattress in his blind, thrashing panic, and the way she had not shown a single ounce of fear. She had leaned her entire body weight against his thrashing form, commanding him with a voice that held more pure dominant authority than any alpha he had ever known. "What is her name?" Kaelen demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate whisper. "Bring her to me immediately. I must reward the savior of my pack." Thorne hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. The heavy silence stretched uncomfortably between them. "She did not stay to claim any glory, my king. After she broke your raging fever and ensured your breathing was steady, she simply vanished back into the lower levels. But the guards who stood in this very room recognized her. They recognized the plain, coarse gray dress and the distinct, sharp scent of her strange chemical mixtures." The breath completely vanished from Kaelen's lungs as a cold, creeping dread began to coil tightly inside his stomach. "Tell me, Thorne." "It was Zara, my king," Thorne whispered softly. "The Omega cleaner from the lowest caste. The very same woman you publicly banished and humiliated at the grand coronation ceremony for bringing her foul-smelling liquids into the Great Hall." The revelation hit the Alpha King with the devastating physical force of a shattering mountain. Kaelen stumbled back a single step, his broad back hitting the heavy wooden bedpost. The world tilted violently on its axis. Zara, the small trembling creature he had looked down upon with absolute supreme disgust, the woman he had cruelly labeled a defective stain upon their sacred traditions and ordered thrown out into the freezing relentless rain. While he had been busy reveling in his own massive physical power and blind arrogant pride, she had been silently working in the dark forgotten shadows. She had possessed the brilliant terrifying intellect required to conquer an invisible deadly enemy that his massive armies could not even touch. A profound agonizing wave of pure regret crashed over him, burying his soul in suffocating guilt. He had stripped her of her dignity and her rightful place within the pack. He had treated her brilliant scientific mind as if it were absolute garbage. Yet, when the ultimate darkness had come to slaughter his loyal men and destroy his entire grand legacy, she had not turned her back on them. She had risked her own life stepping directly into the terrifying plague zones to save the very monsters who had so ruthlessly oppressed her. Kaelen stared down at his own massive hands, feeling a deep, horrifying shame burning through his royal blood. He was the undisputed king of the continent, but in the quiet, terrifying face of true ultimate power, he was nothing but an arrogant, blind fool. Kaelen did not wait for General Thorne to finish speaking. He pushed past the heavy wooden doors of his royal chamber and sprinted down the grand marble corridors. His massive bare feet slapped against the cold polished stone. He ignored the shocked gasps of his elite guards and the frightened stares of the mourning servants. He was a king driven by a singular, desperate, agonizing purpose. He descended deep into the lower levels of the colossal palace, where the air grew damp and smelled heavily of lye and ancient dust. The opulent gold and crimson tapestries vanished, replaced by bare weeping stone walls and flickering cheap tallow candles. This was the miserable, forgotten world where he had banished his savior. He followed the faint, lingering scent of sharp ozone and crushed silverleaf. It was a completely alien aroma in these gloomy depths, acting as a perfect, invisible guiding thread. The scent grew stronger as he approached a heavy rusted iron door hidden behind the refuse vats of the Royal Infirmary. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. Kaelen placed his massive hand against the cold metal, pushing it open. The hinges screamed in loud, agonizing protest, echoing through the quiet cellar. The king stepped inside, and the sheer profound sight of the hidden laboratory stopped the breath. It was a tiny, suffocating stone room. A crude, unstable wooden table was covered in hundreds of mismatched glass bottles, broken window panes, melted into imperfect tubes, and clay bowls filled with strange, colorful powders. The flickering light of a single dying candle cast long, dancing shadows across fragile parchment notes nailed frantically to the damp walls. They were covered in complex, brilliant geometric drawings, mapping the very invisible architecture of life. Kaelen stared at the crude, fragile equipment, realizing with a crushing wave of absolute shame that this incredible woman had conquered a terrifying biological apocalypse using discarded garbage and stolen candle stubs. She had built a miracle in the dark while he had wasted immense resources on blind ancient superstitions. Then he saw her. Zara was slumped entirely motionless over the far corner of the wooden workbench. Her cheek rested against the hard, splintered wood, dangerously close to a bubbling glass beaker of cooling purple liquid. The heavy, coarse gray dress of the lowest caste hung loosely over her dangerously fragile frame. Her small, scarred hands were stained deep blue and black, completely covered in tiny, angry burns from volatile chemical splashes. Kaelen felt a hot, agonizing tear form in the corner of his golden eye. He, the undisputed, invincible king of the mighty continent, was crying over the painful, beautiful reality of an exhausted Omega. He crossed the small, damp room with slow, agonizingly gentle steps. His massive presence felt entirely intrusive in this sacred, brilliant sanctuary. He knelt beside her wooden stool, his huge frame dwarfing her small, delicate body. He could hear her incredibly faint, uneven breathing. She was completely drained, hollowed out by the sheer massive effort of dragging his entire kingdom back from the grave. Kaelen reached out slowly, his large, calloused hands trembling violently as they brushed against her soft, dark hair. The moment his skin touched hers, a profound, absolute spark of pure, elemental energy rushed through his entire body. It was a terrifying, beautiful recognition, a deep, primal settling in his soul that went far beyond mere physical attraction. He carefully slid one massive arm beneath her knees and the other behind her slender back, lifting her effortlessly against his broad chest. Zara weighed absolutely nothing. She was so incredibly light, it broke his massive heart, yet she carried the entire heavy weight of his kingdom upon her bruised shoulders as he lifted her. Zara shifted slightly in her deep, absolute exhaustion. Her head rolled softly against the thick, warm muscles of his chest. She let out a tiny, soft sigh, entirely instinctively, seeking the radiant warmth of his powerful alpha body. The absolute pure trust in that tiny unconscious movement felt like a heavy, jagged blade twisting deep inside his conscience. "You're safe now, brilliant little bird," Kaelen whispered, his deep, rumbling voice thick with overwhelming raw emotion. "You will never scrub another stone floor. You will never hide in the cold, dark shadows again. I swear upon my own life and the ancient blood of my ancestors that I will protect your beautiful mind against the entire world." He turned and carried her out of the suffocating cellar. He did not care who saw them. He carried the lowest-ranking Omega right through the bustling main corridors of the Grand Palace. The Alpha warriors and the noble lady stopped completely dead in their tracks, their eyes wide with absolute profound shock as they watched their invincible king carrying a dirt-stained servant against his bare muscular chest. Kaelen ignored all of them, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying warning. He carried her up the sweeping marble staircases, ascending higher and higher, until he brought her directly into his own massive private bedchamber. He gently laid her fragile, exhausted body onto the pristine crimson silk sheets, pulling the heavy velvet blankets up to her chin. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, resting his face in his hands, utterly consumed by the deep, agonizing weight of his crown and the incredible, miraculous woman he had almost destroyed. Zara floated upward through layers of heavy velvet darkness, returning slowly to the waking world. The surface beneath her was completely alien. Instead of the hard, splintered wood of her work table or the thin, scratchy straw mattress of the servants' quarters, she was resting on something incredibly soft and warm. She opened her eyes cautiously. Above her stretched a magnificent canopy of deep crimson silk woven with golden threads, catching the soft amber glow of the late afternoon sun. Panic spiked suddenly in her chest. She sat up, instantly recognizing the opulent, heavy cedar scent. She was in the bed of the Alpha King. She scrambled backward, tangling her legs in the blankets, expecting the harsh, booming voice of a guard ordering her back to the dirt. But the massive room was perfectly quiet. A quiet movement in the far corner caught her attention. King Kaelen sat perfectly still in a large carved wooden chair near the glowing hearth. He was not wearing his heavy royal armor or his grand crown. He wore a simple white linen shirt, exposing the thick, muscular expanse of his chest. His golden eyes locked onto her, not with the terrifying, crushing dominance she remembered from the Great Hall, but with a profound, gentle reverence that stole the very breath from her lungs. He remained seated, deliberately keeping his massive, intimidating frame lower than her position on the bed. "You slept for 2 full days, Zara," he rumbled softly, his deep voice wrapping around her name like a precious, delicate treasure. "The fever has completely left the vanguard. Your miraculous golden serum saved over 100 of my strongest men. You saved me." Because Zara clutched the thick sheets, her heart beating a terrified rhythm. She expected a trap. She expected him to demand the secret of the— "I merely mixed what the earth provided. I did not use dark magic. Please do not burn my laboratory." Kaelen closed his eyes, a sharp flinch of painful agony crossing his strong, handsome features. When he opened them again, they shone with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I would burn my own castle before I let anyone harm your sanctuary," he swore, his voice thick with regret. "I was blind, Zara. I was an arrogant fool who valued only the sharp edge of a sword and the brute strength of a fang. I threw away the brightest mind in my kingdom because I was too ignorant to understand the light you carried. I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Zara stared at him, completely stunned. The most powerful alpha on the continent was bowing his proud head to a lowly cleaner. He slowly stood up, retrieving a small wooden tray from a nearby table. He placed it gently near her hands. On the tray sat a steaming bowl of rich bone broth and a delicate glass cup filled with clean water. But what caught her breath was the object resting beside the cup. It was her handmade glass viewing lens, the crude microscope she had built from scavenged parts. He had carefully retrieved it from the damp cellar and cleaned away the grime. "I do not want to command you," Kaelen said softly, sitting carefully on the very edge of the large mattress to give her space. "I want to learn from you, Zara. Tell me how you see the world. Tell me how you defeated an invisible monster with discarded stems and crushed rocks." The genuine, absolute hunger for knowledge in his golden eyes broke through the heavy iron walls Zara had built around her heart. She picked up the small glass lens, her fingers tracing the familiar smooth edge. "It is not magic, Kaelen," she began, her voice starting small but growing steadily stronger, with a fierce, passionate conviction. "The world possesses an invisible architecture. Everything around us, the dirt, the trees, the water, even the blood in your veins, is made of tiny, perfectly structured pieces. When those pieces fit together perfectly, there is health in life. But the plague was a broken piece, a jagged shadow that invaded the body and tore the beautiful architecture." Kaelen leaned closer, entirely captivated by the brilliant, luminous fire dancing in her eyes. He watched her delicate hands move passionately as she explained the deep molecular bonds and the pure alkaline power of her golden serum. He did not understand all the complex terminology, but he perfectly understood the undeniable power radiating from her soul. She was magnificent. She was a fierce, beautiful architect of life itself. He reached out slowly, his large, callous fingers lightly brushing against the soft, bruised knuckles of her left hand. The simple, tender contact sent a powerful, cascading shockwave of pure electric warmth straight to her core. Zara stopped speaking, completely breathless, as she looked down at their joined hands. His immense, brutal physical power completely enveloping her scarred fingers, yet treating them with absolute delicate care. For the first time in her entire miserable life, Zara did not feel invisible. She felt perfectly seen, completely valued, and deeply protected by the very man who once terrified her. The thick air in the chamber shifted, charged with a slow-burning elemental tension pulling them closer. Kaelen leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. But before he could close the final distance, a sudden violent crash shattered the tender silence. Heavy, angry boots stomped aggressively against a stone corridor outside the chamber, and the furious shouting of the traditional council elders demanded immediate entry, promising absolute swift destruction. The heavy steel of Kaelen's broadsword glinted dangerously in the flickering torchlight, his massive chest heaved with a terrifying primal rage, pushing the suffocating heat of the room to an absolute breaking point. The traditional guards took a hesitant step backward, their heavy chains clinking nervously against their armor. Facing the pure, unadulterated fury of a dominant Alpha King protecting his chosen mate was a guaranteed death sentence. Malachor, however, remained completely anchored in his blinding fanaticism. "You cannot murder the soul of your own pack," Kaelen, the High Elder, hissed, his wrinkled face contorted in ugly defiance. "If you strike me down, the Earth Goddess will split the ground and swallow your grand legacy whole. This Omega has poisoned your mind." Kaelen took one slow, deliberate step forward, perfectly shielding Zara's fragile frame. "I am the absolute law of this pack, Malachor," he rumbled, his voice dropping to a terrifying resonance. "My law decrees that science and intellect will no longer be treated as dark magic. Zara is the supreme savior of our vanguard. If you refuse her brilliant light, then take your useless weeds and leave my palace forever." Malachor gripped his wooden staff until his ancient knuckles turned stark white. "You're blindly choosing a defective creature over the sacred traditions of your ancestors," the High Elder spat venomously. "You will deeply regret this supreme arrogance. When the sky falls and the rivers run black with corrupted blood, do not come crawling for mercy." Zara watched the fierce exchange, feeling a profound swelling tide of empowerment. For the first time in her painful existence, she did not have to shrink away from their cruel hatred. She stood tall beside a king who fought for her brilliant mind. Before she could speak, a sudden violent commotion erupted from the grand stone corridor outside. The sound of heavy, desperate running footsteps echoed loudly, accompanied by shouted, terrified warnings. A young royal scout burst violently through the threshold, pushing past the hesitant traditional guards. His uniform was entirely drenched in foul-smelling sweat, and his eyes were blown wide with consuming terror. He collapsed heavily onto his knees right at Kaelen's massive boots, gasping violently for air. "My king," the scout choked out, trembling with horrifying panic. "The lower city gates have completely fallen." Kaelen lowered his broadsword, his golden eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Speak clearly, soldier," the king commanded, demanding immediate focus. The scout shook his head frantically, wiping dark mud from his pale face. "It is not the vanguard, my king. It is the poorest outer rings where the low Omegas live. The sickness returned right before dawn, but it is completely different now." Zara felt a sudden icy chill completely freeze the warm blood in her veins. "Explain exactly what you mean," she whispered, stepping out from behind Kaelen's shoulder. The scout looked up with sheer desperate helplessness. "The coughing is gone," he explained rapidly. "There is no stench of rotting blood. The skin of the afflicted turns entirely gray, like dead ash, and their core temperature skyrockets to an impossible level. They are literally burning alive from the inside out, tearing each other apart in the dirty streets." Malachor let out a sharp, victorious cackle that echoed cruelly. "Do you see, Kaelen?" the High Elder shouted, pointing a crooked hand at the scout. "The Earth Goddess is punishing us for your unnatural defiance. The Dark Witch merely hid the original sickness, and now the divine wrath has returned 100 times stronger. Her vile golden liquid is entirely useless." Zara completely ignored the High Elder's venomous gloating. Her brilliant mind was already racing, operating at a terrifying calculated speed, analyzing the devastating new symptoms. The pathogen had never been a divine magical curse. It was a highly intelligent biological organism. The original golden serum had successfully destroyed the primary strain by aggressively breaking down its acidic outer shell. But nature, in its desperate need to survive, was incredibly violent and adaptable. The surviving microscopic spores in the lower city had rapidly evolved, developing a massive, terrifying resistance to her simple alkaline compound. It had completely mutated. She turned to Kaelen, her luminous eyes wide with a horrifying absolute realization. The original cure will not work anymore, Zara stated, her voice tight with a sharp rising panic. The intricate chemical geometry of the sickness has completely changed its very nature. If they are burning from the inside, the pathogen has bypassed the respiratory system and directly infected their central nervous system. It is moving 10 times faster than before consuming their minds. The scout nodded violently, adding that the leftover serum only burned right through the infected flesh, doing absolutely no good. Thousands are dying in the muddy streets right now, and the crazed infected are rioting violently, attempting to breach the inner palace walls to escape the Kaelen tightly gripped the heavy jeweled hilt of his massive broadsword, his strong jaw locking in absolute furious frustration. The terrifying invisible enemy had cleverly shifted its deadly tactics, ensuring that brute strength remained entirely useless. He looked down at Zara, his golden eyes searching for a single shred of bright hope in her brilliant, luminous gaze. "Can you synthesize a stronger new cure, Zara?" he asked, his deep voice carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of his entire crumbling kingdom. Zara looked down at her scarred, trembling hands. The first golden serum had taken days of slow, careful extraction and precise chemical testing. Now she needed a massive miracle of highly unstable volatile chemistry, and she needed to create it before the sun completely set. Time was rapidly, violently running out, and the terrifying shadow of absolute death was already knocking loudly at their front doors. The Grand Royal Armory had been completely stripped of its heavy steel weapons and transformed overnight into a massive, brightly lit sanctuary of science. Huge arched windows let in the fading afternoon light, illuminating rows of pristine crystal basins and heavy iron cauldrons. Kaelen had ordered his elite guards to carry every single piece of Zara's fragile equipment from the damp cellars and place it carefully upon grand oak tables. Zara stood at the exact center of this chaotic, brilliant symphony. The distant, terrifying roar of the infected city rioting violently against the outer palace walls echoed like rolling thunder, but she completely blocked out the deafening noise. Her brilliant mind was locked entirely on the intricate chemical puzzle resting beneath her handmade glass viewing lens. The new mutated pathogen was a terrifying, jagged nightmare, vibrating with a violent, unnatural heat. It did not just multiply, it aggressively consumed the healthy cells, leaving only dead gray ash behind. She pulled a fresh gray linen mask tightly over her face, her scarred hands moving with blinding mechanical speed. The original golden serum was too weak to break the hardened nervous system barrier. She needed a massive chemical catalyst, a highly volatile compound that could violently shock the mutated cells before flushing them out entirely. She grabbed a heavy lead-lined box, pulling out a dark, jagged chunk of unrefined deep earth sulfur. This was incredibly dangerous. Mixing raw sulfur with her alkaline base required a terrifying amount of sustained, blazing heat and absolute flawless precision. A single drop added too quickly would cause a massive, deadly explosion that she understood the profound, terrifying risk. The deep earth sulfur was entirely unpredictable. She added precise measurements of rare liquid mercury and crushed quartz to stabilize the violent reaction. Every single second felt like a heavy, crushing eternity. The blazing heat of the roaring fires turned the massive armory into a suffocating oven. Yet Zara moved with the fluid, graceful precision of a master conductor, leading a deadly symphony. The terrifying screams of the dying echoing from the lower city fueled her relentless, desperate speed. She remembered the cold, frozen wasteland where her brilliant mother had died alone. She swore upon that tragic memory that she would not let this pack burn to ash in their ignorance. General Thorne stood nervously near the grand double doors, watching the tiny Omega command the massive space with absolute terrifying authority. "Bring me more boiling water," Zara commanded, her voice ringing crystal clear over the chaotic din of the distant riots. "And I need the hottest burning coals from the Grand Forge immediately. Do not let the temperature drop a single degree." The heavy guards scrambled blindly to obey her strict orders, completely forgetting their ingrained alpha pride. Zara was no longer the invisible, frightened cleaner. She was the absolute supreme commander of this new battlefield. She poured the crushed dark sulfur into a thick iron crucible, placing it directly over the roaring white-hot coals. The brutal heat instantly scorched the delicate skin of her bare forearms, but she did not flinch. She watched the dark powder melt into a terrifying, glowing red sludge. The intense, acrid smoke stung her eyes, blurring her vision, but her mind remained perfectly, violently clear. She reached for a large glass beaker filled with her strongest concentrated alkaline extract. The deafening sound of a massive wooden battering ram striking the heavy iron gates of the lower city echoed violently through the stone floors. The crazed infected were breaking through the final barrier. Thousands of dying, desperate souls were flooding toward the inner royal sanctum, seeking to tear the pristine palace down to its absolute foundations. Time had entirely run out. The massive oak doors shuddered under the violent impact of a second battering ram. Dust cascaded from the vaulted stone ceiling, raining down upon her immaculate chemical station. She refused to look away from the glowing, unstable liquid. She was entirely committed to this terrifying, glorious moment of absolute creation. Zara held her breath, completely steadying her trembling hands. She began to pour the glowing red liquid fire into the clear alkaline base drop by agonizing drop. The entire heavy mixture hissed and spat, violently threatening to boil completely over the glass edges. The chemical reaction was terrifyingly unstable, requiring a massive physical force to hold the heavy pressure valves shut while the compounds fiercely bonded. But Zara's arms were entirely exhausted, her small muscles screaming in absolute agony. The glass beaker began to vibrate violently in her hands, emitting a high-pitched, terrifying whine that signaled an imminent, devastating explosion. The volatile new formula was completely overpowering her fragile physical strength. She needed an anchor immediately, or they would all perish in blinding fire. The glass beaker whined a high, sharp pitch that cut through the chaos of the armory. Inside the thick vessel, the red sulfur and the dense alkaline base fought each other like caged wolves refusing to bind. Zara threw her entire weight against the iron pressure valves of the distillation chamber. The metal burned right through her thick leather gloves. The expanding chemical gas pushed back with a force she could barely hold. Spiderwebs of white stress fractures bloomed across the reinforced glass. A jet of white-hot steam hissed from a loose side valve, stinging. She was losing her grip. The physical demands of the volatile reaction were simply too great for her exhausted frame. If those valves blew open, the armory would be incinerated, taking their only hope of survival with it. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her boots slipped against the damp stone floor. A shadow fell over her. Two scarred arms wrapped around her shoulders, reaching down to cover her hands on the iron valves. Kaelen had discarded his heavy cape, exposing a plain linen shirt clinging to his chest. He did not issue a loud command. He did not push her aside to take over. Instead, he pressed his broad chest against her back, planting his boots firmly into the stone. He became an immovable mountain behind her. "Hold the center steady, Zara," he murmured close to her ear. His voice resonated through her spine, grounding her racing heart. "I will force the iron closed. Guide me. Tell me exactly what your mind needs." The sudden relief of his presence was profound. For her entire life, she had been taught that omegas were weak and alphas were strong. But right now, strength was not about dominance. It was about trust. It was a perfect synergy. The raw, unyielding physical power of the Alpha King acting as the controlled instrument of her intellect. They were no longer ruler and outcast. They were partners standing together at the edge of the abyss. "Push the left lever down," she instructed. Her voice steadied under the protective heat of his body. "We must crush the sulfur beneath the alkaline weight before the heat evaporates the binding agents." "Do it now, Kaelen?" He flexed his arms. The thick cords of his muscles strained against the outward pressure of the metal chamber. The iron lever groaned, screaming against the friction before finally grinding downward into the lock position. Inside the sealed glass, the swirling red and clear liquids collided, but the raw energy of the deep earth sulfur fought back. The heavy oak table shuddered under their hands. A blinding flash of light erupted from the core of the distillation coil. The primary pressure seal snapped. A wave of scorching heat and jagged glass exploded outward. Kaelen moved before she could even blink. He ripped Zara away from the table, twisting his torso to catch the brunt of the blast. The heat and flying shrapnel slammed into his back, but he made no sound. He folded her against his chest, burying her face in the crook of his neck until the roar of the explosion faded into a ringing silence. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. Zara clung to his shirt, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Are you burned?" she asked, struggling to pull back and inspect his skin. "Did the glass pierce you?" He slowly released his grip. His golden eyes shone with a quiet, undeniable pride. "I am whole, my brilliant queen," he answered, brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. "Turn around. Look at what you have built." Zara turned, looking past his shoulder. The oak table was scorched black. Iron tools were twisted and smoking in the ruin, yet resting perfectly intact in the center of the wreckage was a single reinforced crystal vial. Inside the thick glass sat a luminescent silver liquid. It glowed with a pure, steady light, casting crisp shadows across the destroyed room. The chemical war was over. The cure was synthesized. But their moment of triumph shattered. The stone walls of the armory trembled. The iron gates of the inner courtyard groaned and snapped under immense weight. Through the tall arched windows, Zara heard the blood-curdling screams of the mutated mob swarming the ancient statues. Thousands of infected bodies were storming the grand, sweeping staircases directly toward their sanctuary. The cure was ready, but the army of the dead had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the royal armory splintered under the assault of the mob. Kaelen stepped in front of Zara, drawing his broadsword. The steel rang sharp and lethal in the smoky air. He squared his shoulders, prepared to cut down his own people to protect her sanctuary. Zara reached out and placed a steady hand over his knuckles, pressing the blade downward. "We do not need a sword today, Kaelen," she murmured. "We need a cure." She held the crystal vial up to the light. The silver liquid inside hummed with a beautiful energy. This was her true legacy. A weapon forged entirely from intellect, designed to heal rather than destroy. She slipped a specially crafted glass aerosol nozzle onto the top of the vial, testing the seal. It was time to silence the darkness. Kaelen nodded, pushing the heavy iron barricades aside. The grand double doors swung open. They stepped out onto the sweeping marble balcony overlooking the inner courtyard. The sight below was a massive canvas of suffering. Thousands of infected pack members thrashed blindly against the ancient stone pillars. Their skin was the color of dead ash. They clawed at their own throats, burning from the inside out, driven to madness by the microscopic fire ravaging their central nervous systems. The deafening chorus of their agonizing cries echoed off the tall statues. It was not an army of monsters attacking the gates. It was a broken, terrified family begging for salvation. Zara felt a deep ache in her chest, replacing her lingering fear with a profound, unyielding sense of... Near the base of the wide marble staircase, a cluster of green robes stood out sharply against the sea of gray suffering. The traditional guards were forming a desperate ring around a fallen figure. High Elder Malachor had collapsed onto the damp stone. The proud man who had demanded her execution only hours ago was now convulsing violently. The divine mutation he had praised as a sacred test was actively suffocating him. His wrinkled face was twisted in pure agony, his throat locked tight as the pathogen paralyzed his lungs. The young apprentices kneeling around him wept openly, holding useless, smoldering bundles of crushed sage. They had absolutely no prayers left. Zara descended the wide marble steps, her chin held high. Kaelen walked half a pace behind her, acting as an impenetrable living shield. As they moved deeper into the chaotic throng, Kaelen released a low, continuous rumble from deep within his chest. It was a primal demand for submission, cutting right through the feverish madness of the crowd. The infected rioters parted blindly, stumbling backward from the pure dominance radiating from their Alpha King. But they also parted for the strange luminescent silver glow, clutched tightly in the hands of the Omega. Zara kept her eyes locked directly on Malachor. She did not feel the bitter sting of past humiliations. She felt only the steady, calm rhythm of her own beating heart. The traditional guards lowered their heavy iron chains as she approached. They looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, stepping aside to let her pass without a single word of protest. Zara knelt on the hard, unforgiving stone beside the suffocating High Elder. Malachor forced his eyes open. His pupils were blown wide with blinding panic. He saw the coarse gray dress and the chemical-stained hands of the Omega he had so viciously condemned. A weak, rattling sound escaped his pale lips. He expected her to watch him die. He expected cruel vengeance. Zara merely leaned forward and placed one steady hand behind his neck, supporting his heavy head. "I told you I did not steal the power of the gods, Malachor," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, ringing clarity. "I simply learned how to listen to the..." She brought the delicate glass nozzle directly to his parted lips. With a swift practice motion, she depressed the crystal plunger. A fine silver mist sprayed directly into the back of his dry throat. The highly volatile chemical compound rushed instantly into his failing lungs and entered his tainted bloodstream. For 3 agonizing seconds, Malachor went entirely rigid. The dark veins on his neck bulged. Then the violent, feverish heat broke. The silver catalyst hunted down the mutated spores, dismantling their cellular structure with ruthless molecular efficiency. Malachor gasped violently, drawing in a massive, shuddering breath of clear air. The dark ash color began to drain from his skin, retreating like shadows before the dawn. The violent tremors racking his frail body ceased completely. Malachor blinked, staring up at the pale evening sky as his lungs expanded freely. He was breathing. He was alive. The High Elder weakly raised a trembling hand, reaching out to gently touch the hem of Zara's gray dress. His ancient eyes filled with hot tears of absolute, profound realization. He lowered his bald head against the heavy silence rippled outward across the vast courtyard. The screaming mob watched the impossible miracle unfold before their very eyes. One by one, the rioting warriors, the fearful Omegas, and the proud traditional healers dropped to their knees upon the damp stones. They were not bowing to the formidable Alpha King. They were bowing to the brilliant Omega who held the very breath of life in her scarred hands. The grand hall of the royal palace was a symphony of light and clear air. It was the exact same room where Zara had once dropped a glass vial and shattered her entire world. A month ago, she had stood by the marble pillar, trembling in her coarse gray dress, hiding her chemical-stained hands from the cruel mockery of the elite pack. Today, the heavy oak doors were thrown wide open, letting the bright morning sun wash over the polished stone floors. The oppressive scent of alpha dominance and roasted meat had been entirely replaced by the clean, sharp aroma of fresh pine and blooming silverleaf. Zara stood at the very center of the grand dais. She did not wear the heavy, suffocating silks of a traditional noblewoman. Her dress was a deep, rich forest green, woven with intricate silver threads that mirrored the beautiful geometric structures of the molecular compounds she loved so dearly. The sleeves were pushed up to her elbows, proudly displaying the faded chemical burns and calluses on her delicate skin. They were the proud battle scars of a brilliant mind. Thousands of pack members filled the cavernous hall. The vanguard warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with the low-ranking Omegas and the traditional healers. There was no cruel laughter echoing against the vaulted ceiling today. There were no harsh whispers or pointing. The entire kingdom stood in absolute reverent silence, their eyes fixed entirely upon the small woman who had pulled them from the ashes of their own ignorance. General Thorne stood near the front row, his broad chest swelling with deep pride. Beside him, High Elder Malachor bowed his bald head in quiet respect, leaning lightly upon his carved wooden staff. The dark shadow of the biological plague had been completely eradicated, but the profound lesson it left behind had permanently reshaped their souls. Alpha King Kaelen stepped out from the shadows of the throne. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his golden eyes locked intensely upon Zara. He carried a heavy velvet cushion in his large scarred hands. Resting atop the dark fabric was not a traditional crown of jagged iron and wolf fangs. It was a delicate, breathtaking circlet forged from pure silver, intertwined with small, glowing crystal vials and the polished leaves of the weeping willow. Kaelen stopped before her, his tall, muscular frame radiating a deep, profound warmth. He did not look down at her with the arrogant pride of a ruling conqueror. He looked at her with the deep, unending devotion of an equal partner. "My people," Kaelen began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the vast, silent hall. "For generations we have measured our worth by the sharpness of our claws and the raw physical strength of our warriors. We built grand walls of stone to keep out our enemies, but we allowed the true enemy of blind ignorance to rot our foundations from the inside. We mocked the delicate architecture of the earth. We banished the very light that sought to save us." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath as his gaze swept over the attentive crowd before settling back upon Zara's luminous face. This brilliant woman descended into the dark abyss when the strongest among us could not even stand. Kaelen continued, his voice thick with raw emotion. She did not use ancient magic or hollow prayers. She used the undeniable power of science. She used a sharp intellect and a fierce, unyielding courage to break the chains of death. He picked up the delicate silver circlet, holding it reverently above her dark hair. "Today, I do not just crown a royal mate to sit quietly in the shadows of my throne. Today, I crown an equal ruler. I present to you Zara, the first royal scientist and the true architect of our glorious future." He gently placed the silver circlet upon her head. The cool metal settled perfectly against her brow, a physical manifestation of her hard-won victory. Zara felt a deep, rushing warmth bloom inside her chest, expanding outward until it touched every corner of her soul. She turned slowly to face the massive sea of watching faces. The heavy, paralyzing fear that had governed her entire life was completely gone. She was no longer invisible. She was the luminous, beating heart of a new progressive world. Zara took a step forward, resting her hands lightly upon the edge of the stone dais. "We have survived the great shadow," she spoke, her voice ringing with a clear, beautiful authority that required no loud alpha roar to command attention. "But survival is merely the first. The Earth Goddess gave us a beautiful, complex world filled with hidden mathematical wonders. We will no longer burn our pioneers at the stake for daring to look closely at the light. We will build grand academies instead of just armory. We will teach our young pups how to read the language of the soil and the intricate chemistry of the water. We will heal the sick with knowledge rather than fear." Her words washed over the massive crowd, striking a profound chord in the hearts of the vanguard and the Omegas alike. She looked out and saw the young apprentice healers nodding in fierce agreement. She saw the rough alpha warriors smiling with genuine admiration. The grand hierarchy of pure physical dominance was finally crumbling, giving way to a beautiful era of balance. Zara looked back over her shoulder at Kaelen. The Alpha King stood tall and proud, acting as the steady, unshakable anchor for her soaring spirit. He offered her a soft, knowing smile, entirely content to let her brilliant light outshine his own. Zara faced her people once more, raising her chin to the golden morning sun, ready to build a magnificent new legacy from the ground up. The heavy oak doors of the royal council chamber remained open, allowing the cool afternoon breeze to sweep through the grand room. For centuries, this space had been a dark fortress of alpha dominance, where wars were violently declared and the weak were brutally cast aside. Today, sunlight illuminated the massive wooden table. The ancient maps of territorial conquest had been pushed aside to make room for sweeping architectural blueprints and intricate chemical diagrams. Zara stood at the head of the table. She wore her silver circlet, but her focus was entirely on the thick parchment unrolled before her. She traced a charcoal line across the drawing of the lower city. The rivers will be diverted here, she explained, tapping the center of the map. We will construct deep stone aqueducts to separate the drinking water from the agricultural runoff. Public hygiene is no longer a suggestion. It is the absolute foundation of our survival. The street gutters must be lined with lye, and every household will receive a monthly ration of distilled soap. General Thorne leaned over the table, studying the blueprints with a sharp strategic eye. It will require a massive labor force, my Queen Thorne noted, rubbing his bearded jaw. We will have to reassign 3 battalions of vanguard warriors from the border patrols to dig the trenches. It is a vast undertaking. Zara met his gaze without a flinch. An invisible pathogen moves much faster than a rival army general, she stated firmly. Our warriors are strong, but their swords cannot fight corrupted water. The true defense of this kingdom begins with clean hands and sterile hearths. Kaelen sat beside her, his muscular frame relaxed against the carved wooden chair. He did not interrupt her or attempt to soften her commands. He simply watched her with quiet, unending pride. Reassign the battalions, Thorne the king ordered smoothly. Let the vanguard learn how to build the future instead of just defending the past. Zara rolled up the hygiene blueprint and pulled a second heavy parchment toward her. This document held the true weight of her revolution. It was the complete rewriting of the ancient pack laws. The old decrees that bound Omegas to the shadows, dictating their lives as mere servants and breeders, were about to be erased entirely. The caste system is officially abolished, Zara announced, her voice carrying a steady, undeniable weight. Intelligence and aptitude will determine a person's place in this kingdom, not their birth rank. Omegas will no longer be confined to the lower levels. They will have full equal rights to education, to property, and to seats upon this very council. A low murmur rippled across the far end of the long table. A few of the older traditional elders shifted uncomfortably in their green robes, struggling to accept the massive societal shift. One elder stood up, his hands resting cautiously on the wood. To give Omegas access to the Grand Archives, to let them sit in judgment over Alphas, it goes against centuries of tradition, he murmured, though his voice lacked the fanatical venom of the past. Zara looked directly at him, her expression softening into a fierce, compassionate clarity. Tradition almost buried us in a mass grave, she reminded him gently. It was an Omega who stood in the fire to forge the cure. Intellect has no secondary gender. A mind capable of understanding the complex geometry of life is a mind that deserves to lead. The elder lowered his eyes in silent concession, sitting back down. The argument was over. The undeniable truth of her victory shielded her reforms from any real opposition. Zara dipped her quill into the dark inkwell, signing her name at the bottom of the sweeping new decree. Beside her signature, Kaelen pressed his heavy royal seal into the hot red wax, making the equality law permanent and absolute. We will convert the empty Southern Armory into the first Grand Academy of Science, Zara continued, her spirit soaring as she laid out her ultimate vision. It will be open to every pup in the kingdom regardless of their rank. We will teach them botany, chemistry, and structural engineering. We will fund research into new medicines and agricultural yields. We will never again fear the unknown because we will educate our people to understand. As the council meeting concluded, the lords and elders filed out, carrying the blueprints and decrees that would reshape their world. Zara remained at the table, organizing her notes. The soft sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Elara, the older Omega who had once smuggled her stale bread in the damp cellars, stepped hesitantly into the grand chamber. Elara was no longer wearing the coarse gray rags of a cleaner. She wore a neat woven tunic of soft blue, her gray hair pulled back cleanly. She held a thick leather-bound book to her chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Zara walked around the heavy table and took the older woman's hands. I have been assigned to the new academy, Elara whispered, her voice trembling with profound joy. They are going to teach me how to read the ancient healing texts. I am 50 years old, and I'm finally going to learn how to read. Zara felt a hot tear slip down her cheek. She pulled Elara into a fierce, warm embrace. You're going to learn everything, Elara, Zara promised, her voice thick with emotion. You're going to step into the light, and you're never going back to the shadows. As she held her old friend, Zara looked out the tall arched window at the bustling courtyard below, knowing her mother's tragic sacrifice had finally blossomed into a beautiful, lasting dawn. 5 years had passed since the great shadow was completely eradicated. The heavy, thick stone walls of the Southern Armory had been entirely dismantled and replaced by soaring arches of pristine white marble and expansive clear glass windows. This was the Royal Academy of Science and Medicine. The golden morning sun poured over the bustling courtyard, illuminating a beautiful, bright new world. Zara walked down the wide, smooth stone pathways, her deep, rich green gown brushing softly against the vibrant, blooming silver leaf planted along the garden borders. The air did not smell of heavy fear or sharp lie anymore. It smelled of fresh parchment, blooming flowers, and the crisp, sweet scent of ozone from the nearby distillation laboratories. The magnificent courtyard was a living, breathing testament to her ultimate hard-won victory. Young alphas and omegas sat comfortably together on the lush green grass, sharing heavy leather-bound books and eagerly discussing the intricate architecture of plant cells. There were absolutely no divisions here. The ancient, brutal hierarchy of physical dominance had completely melted away, replaced by a profound collective thirst for higher knowledge. Zara watched a tall young alpha warrior gently helping a small omega boy adjust the delicate brass lens of a viewing apparatus. Her heart swelled with an immense, unyielding pride. She had not just cured a terrifying biological plague, she had cured the deep-rotting ignorance of an entire civilization. Kaelen walked closely beside her, his massive, heavily scarred hand enveloping hers in a warm, steady, comforting grip. He wore a simple tunic of dark crimson, leaving his broad, muscular arms completely bare to the gentle morning breeze. He was still the undisputed king, still the absolute most formidable alpha on the entire continent. But his raw, intimidating power was now beautifully tempered with a deep, profound wisdom. He looked out over the peaceful, thriving courtyard, his golden eyes shining with a quiet, absolute contempt. They stopped perfectly still beneath the sprawling, protective branches of a massive weeping willow tree, right at the very center of the Grand Academy grounds. Sitting comfortably on a thick woven blanket in the dappled, pleasant shade was their young, beautiful daughter. Little Princess Eliana had inherited her father's thick, dark hair and her mother's fiercely inquisitive, luminous eyes. She was not playing with wooden swords or stuffed training wolves. Eliana was deeply, entirely focused on 3 small crystal bowls resting carefully on the grass in front of her. Using a small carved wooden dropper, the little pup carefully transferred a few distinct drops of a bright blue liquid made from crushed berries into a bowl of pale yellow citrus. She held her breath, waiting patiently for the unseen chemical reaction. The 2 liquids swirled together, transforming instantly into a brilliant, glowing green. Because Eliana let out a delightful, ringing laugh, clapping her small, delicate hands together in pure, unadulterated joy. "Look, Mama," the little princess cheered loudly, holding the small crystal bowl proudly up to the warm sunlight. "I made the beautiful colors dance." Zara knelt gently onto the soft grass, carefully lifting her beautiful daughter into her warm, loving arms. "You did perfectly, my clever, brilliant little bird," Zara murmured, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against the pup's smooth forehead. "You found the hidden, magical truth inside the water." Kaelen knelt right beside them, wrapping his massive protective arms around both his brilliant queen and his royal heir. He buried his handsome face in Zara's dark hair, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of sharp ozone and fresh rain that always perfectly anchored his heavy soul. "You have given her a beautiful world where she will never have to hide her brilliant light," Kaelen whispered, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating with absolute, unending devotion. "She will grow up safely knowing that her sharp mind is the absolute greatest weapon she possesses." Zara leaned her head peacefully against his broad, strong chest, looking out over the magnificent, sprawling academy. She thought briefly of the damp, suffocating cellars where she had once scrubbed cold stone floors until her knuckles bled. She thought of the bitter, freezing winter night, when her own brilliant mother was cruelly cast out into the dark wasteland for daring to understand the earth. Those painful, heavy ghosts of the past were finally at true peace. The Grand Kingdom was no longer ruled by the sharp edge of a sword or the brutal bite of a fang. It was ruled entirely by the beautiful, undeniable truth of science, by deep, profound compassion, and by the unbreakable, sacred bond of equality. Zara closed her eyes, listening to the happy, ringing laughter of her daughter and the gentle, soft rustle of the willow leaves, knowing her legacy of light would shine brightly for 1,000 generations. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.